Cool. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started again. We are 2 minutes behind, which I think is pretty good so far. Let's see if we can keep that sort of level of delay going through to the end of the day. So next up, I'd like to introduce Kartik Nayak from Duke University, who we commissioned to do some, whose research we have funded into certain aspects of privacy, preserving proof of stake, and what the trade-offs are with regards to safety, liveness, and privacy. And I'm sure that Kartik will do a far better job of explaining that than I can, but thank you very much, Kartik, for coming here.
Thank you so much, Jack, for the kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here. And as Jack mentioned, I'll be talking about privacy and private proof of stake protocols. Or in other words, can private proof of stake protocols achieve all of safety, liveness, and privacy? So let me start off with something that we all know about, Bitcoin, proof of work blockchain, where the key goal is to achieve consensus, where parties or miners agree on an ever-growing ledger of transactions. So as an example over here to the right, you can see Alice, Bob, and Charlie, who are trying to update this blockchain on their own. So these miners, as well as the users of the blockchain, are connected to each other on a P2P network. So whenever a user, let's say Karthik, let's say I pay $10 to Jack or 10 ZEC to Jack, I put it up on the P2P network. It will eventually be received by one of these miners, let's say Bob, and Bob would share it with everyone else, Charlie and others. So to include this transaction onto the chain, all of these miners agree, all of these miners actually compete with one another to produce the next block, to produce the next proof of work. And this computation turns out to be energy intensive, and eventually someone wins. Let's say Bob wins over here, and Bob includes a block which has this transaction. And eventually Bob will share this transaction with everyone. So winning this proof of work is directly proportional to the amount of computation power you put in. So the more compute power you have in, the higher is the probability that you will produce the next block. So you have two key properties that holds. One is safety and one is liveness. Safety says that no two miners will disagree on the sequence of transactions. And liveness says that whenever you send in a transaction to this chain, it will eventually be included in the ledger. And with Bitcoin, you achieve both of these properties so far as honest parties hold a majority of the computation power. With Bitcoin, you have no privacy in this system. Any party can see the sender-receiver value involved in the transaction. So that's a proof of work blockchain, which has a very high energy consumption due to the creation of proof of work. And that's why people have been investigating the use of proof of stake, where parties are elected proportional to their stake. Example protocols today include Ethereum, Algorand, and Ouroboros. And the assumption over here changes from an honest majority computation power to an honest majority or 67% majority stake. Right? And the techniques, instead of using proof of work, you may end up using some other self-selection techniques. As an example, you would use something like a verifiable random function, which allows you to generate a unique verifiable random value that cannot be predicted by an adversary who does not have access to your secret stake. So with proof of stake blockchains, again, you have safety and liveness under the honest majority stake assumption. And again, you still don't have privacy. And I'll add one more point over here compared to what I was saying earlier. So in addition to learning everything about the transaction, you also know the creator of the block, because proof of stake is less permissionless compared to something like a proof of work system. So you know all the stakers involved, and you know which staker has created the block. So you can make proof of work blockchains energy efficient by moving to proof of stake. The other dimension to think about is privacy. And over there, that is where Zcash is. So you can hide the transactions using cryptography. At a high level, the kind of guarantee you give when you're creating a transaction is to say that you basically provide a zero-knowledge proof to say that there is a sender who has sent some money to a receiver, and the sender has access to these funds. Very, very high level. And if you do this, with a protocol like Zcash, you can achieve safety, liveness, and privacy. In particular, this is required for the functioning of any blockchain, and I'll call this out because I'll be using this later. You would typically know, a sender and a receiver would typically know, when its transaction is committed, or which block contains its transaction. So with this, you can move from a proof of work blockchain to one that provides you privacy as well. So it seems like these are two different improvements in two different directions, and a natural question to ask is, hey, can we get both of these? Can we get the best of both worlds? One direction gives you privacy but not energy efficiency, the other direction gives you energy efficiency but not privacy, and with private proof of stake, you'll get the best of both worlds. And indeed, I'm not the first person to ask this question. Even 4 years ago with Ouroboros, Crypsinos, as well as this other work by Ganesh Orlandi and Shudi, they've already come up with protocols that can actually give you private proof of stake. And the key observation that they had was, all of the parameters or the ways of getting both of these properties, they align except for one fact. And that is, there is an additional leakage in proof of stake protocols. And that is that the creator of the block is known. And the basic question they ask is, hey, can we hide the identity of this creator? And instead of using a VRF, they use, intuitively speaking, some notion of an anonymous VRF. And it basically has all the properties of a VRF, but you hide the identity of the creator of the block. And this kind of separates, so with this, you do not know who the creator is. And at least intuitively speaking, you should obtain all of the guarantees that you did with private proof of work blockchains. So with that, you achieve a private proof of stake blockchain. Thus, we have a proof of stake blockchain with privacy, safety, and liveness. Or do we? So this is the question that we asked a couple of years ago. And for this, from a protocol standpoint, it seems things are fine, but if you try to go down at the network layer, if you look closely, this prior work on Crypsinos, they have a footnote which says, if you assume an anonymous broadcast channel at the network layer, then the submitter or the block proposer would not be leaked. Okay? And what this is saying is, at the network layer, if you try to tap on to who is sending what messages, perhaps you would still learn who is sending these messages, and that can reveal your stake. So at a high level, they argue, hey, someone who's spoofing your network, even then, so far as you use some sort of an anonymous broadcast communication channel, your network level metadata will stay hidden and everything would be okay. So what we observed is that, even with anonymous broadcast channels, we can potentially learn the stake of a party. And the key attack idea that we used, the key fact that we used is the following. In a chain, I can identify my own transaction in the chain. And somehow, if I can manipulate the network, then I can create a situation where the mempool of a victim party is different from the mempool of someone else, from all other miners, for example, or all other stakers, for example. So in general, if I can control which party receives my transaction for some period of time, then I can potentially know who mined the block. So let me try to be a little more concrete. Let's say I'm an adversary and I create this red transaction. And I share this with some party P at time T. Okay, so over here you see two timelines. The first is the timeline for party P, and the second is the timeline for everyone else. Party P receives this transaction at time T, and everyone else receives this transaction some time later, some delta time later. Okay, where delta is a parameter. So how do you actually achieve this delay in practice? You can just rely on a regular network delay. That may not be a lot in practice though. You can try to eclipse this party P. Or you can use some sort of networking layer, P2P level details on trying to actually delay this message. For example, to achieve communication efficiency at the network layer, all of these protocols, starting with Bitcoin, they use what is called as an in-blocking mechanism, where you send the message, the entire block, only if a node actually has it. It turns out that you can use this, an adversary can use this to its advantage to actually create, a temporary difference in the mempools of different parties. So far as you can achieve this, all the adversary now needs to do is observe the state of the network and observe when these blocks are created. So let's say, for example, this red transaction that the adversary created came in at time tk, all right? And if that happens, all the adversary needs to check is, how tk is related to t plus delta. In particular, if tk is less than t plus delta, then this is the time at which, only party P had access to the red transaction, and it must be the case that party P is the one who mined this block. So this gives you a very simple mechanism to know or to sample how many times a party is elected, and this is directly related to its stake. You may ask, well, this happens only because of what the party has for delta time, so can it just ignore the transactions received in the last delta time, or does such a fix actually work, right? Or some similar fix, does it work? And it turns out that such fixes do not work, and intuitively it's because you can actually create a similar attack on a different time scale. In fact, we actually extended this intuition, and I'm not going to get into this, but we actually showed a lower bound that connects privacy, safety, and liveness, or to be more specific, anonymity, safety, and liveness. So I'm not going to talk about this, but I think the high-level point that we are trying to make over here is that there is a fundamental barrier to achieving all these three when we formally define these in a very specific way. Although a caveat of what we do over here also says, our attack is very specific to, or a lower bound is very specific to deterministic blockchain protocols, and none of the proof of stake blockchains are deterministic. But having said that, so far as, the logically that the lower bound should still hold, the intuition should still hold for all of the protocols unless you're specifically using randomization for privacy. So, in the rest of my talk, I'm going to do two things. One, I will explain a simple attack using the sampling mechanism that we described. And then I will speak about, what can we do to actually counter this lower bound. So there are two attacks that we came up with. So the first one is called as a reverse tagging attack. And this applies to any deterministic blockchain that provides a guarantee which says, if a transaction is sent to all honest parties, that is the strongest condition you can ask for, then it will be in the output. And let's say our goal is to identify a bound on the stake of some party, say some victim P. So here's what the attack looks like. So let's say you have this victim P to the left. You have the adversary to the right. Let's say I'm going to split the adversarial stake into 5 different stake values, A1 through A5. And all the other parties, let's say P1 to P4, are in between. I will note that from a protocol standpoint, the adversary actually behaves honestly all through and only chooses its input. At the network layer, it is going to do the kind of manipulation that I was suggesting earlier, where it is going to ensure that some parties receive this block and some parties do not. Okay, so to start off with, let's say there is this red transaction that the adversary creates and shares it with everyone except victim P. Let's say at the end of this, a block is produced and it contains this transaction. What can we say we learn from this? Actually, it turns out that we can learn nothing from this process. It's because the blockchain says, if you sent this to all honest parties, and note that over here, when I say all honest parties, 1 minus f fraction of the stake, and over here adversary is behaving as honest. So it contributes towards this 1 minus f. So what we say is, so far as you send this transaction to 1 minus f of the stake, at that point, it would be output in the block. But, the protocol can be nicer and in that, even if it is sent to a fewer set of parties, it can still output. So just the fact that, the transaction is output over here does not mean much. So we'll repeat this attack with a different red transaction, but now the adversary does not play with all of these red transactions. For example, A5 will not play with red transactions. It will behave as if it never had this red transaction. And you keep repeating this process until you reach a stage where you have a block which does not contain a red transaction. At this point, we can hopefully conclude something, and that is, our blockchain says, so far as you send the stake to 1 minus f fraction of the parties, at that point, it had to be output. The fact that it is not output implies that it is not a part, that the sum of parties who had this red transaction is not 1 minus f. So less than 1 minus f fraction of stakers played with this red transaction. And now you can argue that, the adversary knows how much stake it has and how much of it did not play with this red transaction. And with that, you can actually do some simple arithmetic and compute a bound on P stake. And over here, it turns out to be greater than f minus d, where d is the fraction that did not play, d is the fraction of the adversarial stake that did not play with this red transaction. So intuitively, this gives you an idea of, what an adversary can do. At the same time, there are drawbacks with this attack. It's assuming a deterministic protocol with a stringent liveness condition. It is only giving you a one-sided bound. It is saying that an adversary, that a party stake is greater than f minus d, not how much greater than this value. And finally, in terms of the strategy used to actually perform this attack, it is using an inefficient linear strategy, so it will require multiple trials. So the cost for an adversary to actually perform such an attack is fairly high. It turns out that we can address all of these concerns. So this is an attack that we described in our work for 2 years earlier, and we have some recent work which will be published in Usenet Security next week, where we address actually all of these concerns to come up with a new set of attacks where your liveness condition need not be so stringent, even with a probabilistic liveness condition. All that says is, if you send it to more honest parties, the faster it is that it will be included in the chain. With such a liveness condition as well, you can carry out such an attack. And the bound, instead of giving you a one-sided bound, you can actually get a bound that is arbitrarily close to the true stake. And finally, in terms of the attack efficiency, we can improve it drastically by employing some sort of binary search-like strategy in logarithmic time. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into the details of this particular attack, and rather spend my time asking, well, there are these attacks possible, there are these lower bounds. Does that mean we can never have a private POS protocol with privacy, safety, and liveness? So at some level, our lower bound kind of hints at there being a fundamental barrier between the three. So you cannot, if we define all of these properties in a stringent manner, then perhaps we cannot achieve all these three simultaneously. But well, can we obtain any sort of a trade-off between these three properties? I think that's the next natural question. In particular, can we trade off either safety for privacy or liveness for privacy? So in this talk, I'm going to explore, can we perhaps trade off safety for privacy? And here's a potential approach. So intuitively speaking, the reason why our attack works is because you're able to sample how many times a party is elected using proof of stake, and this sampling is directly related to its true stake, right? So that is what allows us to learn the stake of a party. So what if proposals are elected instead of, through the stake, what if proposals are elected with equal weights for every party? So at that point, their stake is not revealed at all, right? Does this work? Well, if you think about it for 10 seconds, you'll realize that this trivially does not work because we'll have no Sybil resistance whatsoever. Because at that point, adversary will come in, with little stake and, with a lot of parties, and all of the blocks will be produced by the adversarial parties, right? So this is not at all secure under proof of stake. So what this tells us is that, on the one end, if everything is representing the true stake of a party, at that point, you can learn it. On the other, you cannot be entirely independent of the stake either. On one end, you're giving up privacy entirely. At the other, you're giving up safety entirely. So for safety, your stake still needs to be proportionate to, if not exactly the same as the true stake. So given this intuition, our idea is to not represent the true stake of a party, but use some sort of a noisy stake for each party. Okay, so over here on the left, you're seeing a histogram of, on the x-axis, the different parties, and on the y-axis, their stake. So in this example, there are 5 different parties. So what we argue is we can perhaps perturb or noise the stake of each of these parties in such a way that for all of the election purposes or proof of stake purposes, what is used is this noisy stake. Okay, so as an example, for the first party, the noisy version, after you perturb it, the stake increases slightly. For the second party, it decreases slightly, and so on and so forth. If you do this, then intuitively, hopefully, this is what is revealed to an adversary. And the high-level intuition over here is now the adversary can only infer this distorted stake. And at that point, differences in stake due to smaller transactions are hidden. So if this noise is adjusted appropriately in such a way that you're trying to hide transactions of a certain size, you're still able to do so in this process. So again, if you do, a $10 million transaction or, something that represents, let's say, a large percentage of the entirety of Zcash, ZC, at that point, it is still hard to hide, what is happening, the change of stake that happens. But for smaller transactions, perhaps you can still guarantee something. Right? So there are several challenges. So I'm explaining the very high-level idea over here, and there are several challenges that need to be met before we can achieve this. For one, if I'm noising the stake, how do I ensure that an adversary is noising it correctly? So it needs to submit some sort of a proof that it has done this correctly as per the specification. So I'm talking about noise at a very imprecise level right now, but we need to be able to appropriately select this so that we can meaningfully reason about privacy over here. If we are distorting the stake, then this can result in an increase of distorted stake for an adversary. As an example over here, if the first and the fifth party are adversarial, then the stake increased. And in this election process, in the proof of stake process, you want the adversary to be, say, less than 33%, then the distorted stake should be less than 33%, which means the actual adversarial stake that you're tolerating is even lesser, let's say 25%. So you're trading off safety for privacy over there. And finally, I think I spoke about noising this once, but the stake keeps changing over time, right? So you need to account for doing this multiple times at intermittent intervals. So we address all of these challenges using what is called differential privacy. So we define, we describe differential privacy mechanisms, which is the gold standard for achieving privacy in such settings. And I'm not going to go into the details of exactly what we do over here, but at a very high level, the guarantee you get is that your adversary cannot distinguish the stake for a single party by up to some parameter, some additive parameter alpha. So you're trying to hide transactions of size alpha, for instance. Or more concretely, an adversary can distinguish between a victim's unknown stake X and a guess value Y if X minus Y is greater than alpha. So to evaluate what kind of guarantees we would get for the mechanisms we described, we actually performed a case study on Ethereum's parameters because those were very well described. And over here, we're trying to showcase the kind of trade-offs we are making in this process. So on the y-axis, you see this parameter alpha, which is intuitively you can think of it as, I'm trying to hide transactions of size alpha. And on the x-axis, you see this parameter epsilon, which I have not spoken about at all until now. But in differential privacy, you can think of it as, higher epsilon implies lower privacy. So we are trying to go higher on the y-axis, that is good, because you're trying to hide larger transactions, and left on the x-axis, that is good, because that implies high privacy. And the three curves that you see over here are the different adversarial stakes that we are trying to tolerate in the process. So as I described earlier, after distortion, your stake the adversarial stake can increase. So the true adversary that you can tolerate is smaller. Right? So over here, we're thinking about three different adversaries, f equals 20%, 30%, and 25%. So a first observation that you can make is there is an inherent privacy utility trade-off over here. And let's say we pick f equals 20% as an example. That is the blue curve over here. At that point, you can see that as alpha increases, that is, if you go higher up on over here, you keep going to the right? Which means epsilon increases as well, and your privacy decreases. So intuitively, as you try to hide larger and larger transactions, the probabilistic guarantee that you're getting per transaction reduces. Second, as the adversary changes, or based on how much reduction of safety you're trying to achieve, there is an effect on alpha and epsilon. So as you go from towards lesser and lesser adversaries as f decreases, or as you move from the green to red to the blue curve, you can observe two things. If you keep one of these parameters fixed, let's say if you fix privacy or if you fix epsilon, that is, you're going up over here. At that point, you can see that you're able to tolerate a larger alpha. So for a fixed privacy, as the adversary reduces, you can hide larger transactions, which is intuitively true. I think it's formally bounding over here. And similarly, if you fix the size of a transaction, alpha in this case, then as you move from green to red to blue, you can see you're going to the left, which means you're obtaining lesser epsilon or stronger privacy. So with that, I have explained all of this at a very high level, but I'll share appropriate resources for you to read to learn more about this. So with that, I'll conclude my talk. We said there's a fundamental barrier to obtain all three properties simultaneously. Second, we discussed reverse tagging attacks and stake inference attacks, which are very specific attacks. So we did not speak about this, but our attacks very much rely on network level manipulation, which means, while network level defenses cannot entirely eliminate these attacks, but in practice they may be helpful in mitigating at least these attacks. And finally, we spoke about the use of differential privacy at the protocol layer to trade off between safety, liveness, and privacy. So we spoke about trading off safety for privacy, but perhaps one can also do something similar to trade off liveness for privacy. So before ending my talk, I would like to thank my collaborators from NCSU, Edinburgh, and at Duke University. So this is based off of two works, one published in Oakland 21 a couple of years ago. And the second one is in Usenix Security, which would be in a week's time. So for more details about this talk, I explained it at a high level. There are more details on our blog post on decentralized thoughts. Those are the links. And they also have links to the papers in case you want to learn more in even more detail. Thank you so much, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thanks, Kartik. It's time just for one question, and that is, are there any downsides to preserving the privacy of block creators, in your opinion?
Sorry, come again?
Are there any downsides or risks to concealing and preserving the privacy of the block creators?
So there are no downsides to concealing it. I think what our observation is that does not suffice to actually give you privacy. So existing works, right, I think the ones that I cited from 2019, they already hide the creators of the block. I think what we are arguing is that there are other side channels through which you can still learn the information that you are trying to hide at the protocol layer. So if you think about it, you can think about it at different layers. So from a protocol layer standpoint, life is good. But when you go back, when you go down at the network layer, at that point you can still perhaps learn information. And that can be bad. It was not a concern with proof of work blockchains because the amount of money you hold was not related to your consensus mechanism at all. It was proof of work that was allowing you to propose. With proof of stake, that's not true. It is now related to your stake.
Okay. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
And we're going to break for lunch now. Lunch is right out here. After lunch, we will be splitting into 2 tracks. Track 1 will be in here, and track 2 will be right next door. In here, we'll have a few regulatory focus sessions, and then next door we'll have ML, Ian, and I can't remember who else, Naomi Brockwell, talking about various aspects of privacy, whether Zcash has morals, and then Naomi's talk will be about the fundamentals of privacy. So yeah, enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you after the break.